Hi, welcome to Level Up Your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. There's no slides in this talk today, it's all live code. So let's look at the code we're going to build. Well, here's our GitHub repository and it's empty. We also have an empty code folder. Let's fill it up with content. First thing, .NET New. .NET New will scaffold out a website, and so we could use this to build a website that we can deploy. .NET New MVC --name level up DevOps --output dot. That puts it in the current folder, where by default, if we left out the --output, it would go into a subfolder. Now we've got a website. Great. Let's open that up in VS Code. Now to put it in a container, our first stop is to create a Docker file and a .dockerignore file. Docker file. Now it's important that this is named Docker file and not dockerfile.txt. Let's come back to this one. New file, .dockerignore. Now a dockerignore file is not that unlike a gitignore file. Let's create one of those, .gitignore. Now gitignore has all the things that we don't want to commit to source control. Bin, obj, star.user, star.suo, the .vs folder. That's all the things in our gitignore file, things that we won't commit to source control. Our dockerignore file is exactly the same, all the things that we don't want to copy into our image as we're building it. We also want to ignore things like app settings.development.json and in here properties launch settings.json. Launch settings.json is all of the settings to run in development to hook up IS Express. We won't need that in our production Docker runtime. Okay, now we're going to say from, and we'll start on the shoulders of giants. Let's head out to Docker Hub and look for .NET. Scrolling down, the .NET SDK, that's the right repo. Let's click in there, and here's our base image. mcr.microsoft.com.net SDK 5.0. Perfect. Now we'll use the Alpine variant because that's a little bit smaller. Now let's copy in all of the things from our current working directory where we run the docker build command into the current directory in our image. Well, what is that current directory? workdir/src. Now there's nothing magic about src, but that works. Now we need to run a few commands. .NET restore, .NET build, and we'll build in release mode. .NET test, .NET publish-c release-o/dist. This is that publish, not that unlike Visual Studio's right-click publish. It'll grab all the files and put them in place that we can copy to our web server. So now to run each of these as Docker commands, we will say run. Now run will run as we are building up the image. So once the image is done, all of these things will be in place. Finally, we can set our workdir to /app. Let's run cp/dist to /app. And finally, cmd is .NET level up devops.dll, the command that we run to start up our container. Now we do need a few environment variables. Let's set those in place. Just telling us to run in production mode, that we want to start ASP.NET on port 80, and that we want to expose port 80 outside of our container. Now this Docker file is perfect. We could use this in production, but there's a few things that we can tidy up to make it even better. Right now, we have our build tools and our source code in our production runtime. And we're restoring the files after we copy in everything. If we change a few lines of source code, we'll have to restore all of our packages. We really want to do a .NET restore before we do a copy. Well, we still need to tell it what our manifest is, so let's copy in level up devops.csproj into the current folder. And now we can .NET restore all those libraries. If we haven't changed any dependencies, those libraries will hold, and that will be great. Next up, we want to start from a different base image. Now, here's the SDK image. Also in that repository, we have ASP.NET. That includes our .NET runtime. Perfect. We don't have our build tools. We now have one image that is our production runtime, and we have a second image that is our build server. Now, that's not quite the right word, but let's call this build server image and production server image. Now here we have a workdir of /app, and here we're copying, but this would copy from our host machine. Let's switch this to a copy /dist to the current directory, but we don't want to copy from our host machine. We want to copy from equals build. Well, what is build? Well, let's call this one as build. Great. Now we have a Docker file that is completely ready to go. We have our Docker ignore file that tells us everything that we don't want to copy into Visual Studio. So now we could run docker build, docker run, and we would get that website running in that image. Next up, let's copy in some Kubernetes resources. Now I'm just going to copy this from the last project that we did because, well, there's a lot going on here. Yep, we have last time. Let's replace last time with level up DevOps. Great. So we have a deployment here. We have a service. We have an ingress controller, and we have an annotation here that will allow us to do DNS inside of Azure. We do have some secrets now, though, that we'll need to replace. Image label, ACR URL, image label, AKS URL. We'll do that during the build. We'll replace those in place with secrets so that these details don't end up in our source control. Okay, so we're ready to go. Let's start committing this content. We can take a look at each file. In this case, all of them are new, so there isn't going to be a whole lot of left and right, but let's save all, close all, and let's initial commit. Not sure why those need to be named that way, but every initial commit in a repository is named initial commit. Perfect. So now we've got all those changes. Git status, yep, everything is committed. Git push origin main. And now we've got all of that content up on GitHub. Let's come back to GitHub and refresh the page, and we see that we now have all of the source code. Perfect. We have the website, we have the Docker file and Docker ignore file, we have the Kubernetes YAML file. We now need to build it. Let's come in here to Actions and take a look at how we can build up this thing. Here in Actions, we have lots of different templates that allow us to do amazing things. Now, we could pick from lots of things, but I'm just going to look for a Docker image, and let's get started with this one. Docker, publish a Docker container. We could start with a blank action as well. Docker and Kubernetes. Okay. Docker build and push Kubernetes apply. That's what we want to do. We'll want to do it on the main branch. That's perfect. Tags and pull requests. No, we don't want to publish using tags and pull requests. So we'll probably create a separate build that will do that. Yes, build. Yes, we'll want to do this on Ubuntu latest, and the first step is checkout. We don't need any of this part. So now we have a Docker build. Let's go grab that better. A Docker build and a Docker push. Now we do need to do some interesting things. Here in this build, we need to -t, we'll tag it as a name. Well, we could hardcode level up DevOps, but we probably want to include our registry. We can go into the secrets here, and we have ACR password, ACR URL, ACR username, ACR URL, our AKS URL, and kubeconfig. I've set these secrets up in our GitHub repository previously so that we can leverage them. We can leverage them by just doing $curly brace, secrets.thing. So, for example, here inside our tag, we probably want to tag it as, instead of super secrets, ACR URL. That's the URL to our registry. We also want to say, let's give it a version, and we'll give it a version of github.sha. That's the git hash for this. Perfect. So we've built this and tagged it the way we expect. And so now we want to push that version up to our Docker registry. In this case, we'll use Azure Container Registry. So let's do a login, Docker login here in the marketplace, and we will look for this one. That one looks good. Now this action tells us all the details that we need to be able to do this task. So between the checkout task and the run task, we'll add this Docker login task. Let's give it the correct amount of indentation for YAML. Perfect. Now here in the Docker login task, it's going to ask us for a registry. Well, what's the registry? We have the secrets ACR URL, so let's use that. That's the registry that we're going to log into. What's our username? Well, we have a secret for username. It is ACR username. What's our password? Our password is ACR password. And do we want to log out at the end of the job? The default is true. That's totally fine. Great. So now that we're logged into Docker, now when we do a Docker push, everything will work just fine. Next thing we want to do a kubectl apply -f-k8s.yaml. Now that kubectl apply, we do need to log into Kubernetes. Let's come back to the marketplace and let's look for a Kubernetes set context. Kubernetes set context. Perfect. So we'll grab the YAML for this task, set that in place. Let's indent it properly. And now we can do some login. The default login is a kubeconfig, so that looks great. Let's use kubeconfig as our login mechanism. There we go. And what is the kubeconfig? Well, we happen to have a secret called kubeconfig, so let's set that in place. Kubeconfig. With that, we can log in correctly to Kubernetes, and we don't need any of the rest of this. Now when we say kubectl apply, we will go grab all of the pieces and be able to log into Kubernetes just fine. Now here in the Kubernetes YAML file, we do have a bunch of variables. So all of the things, AKS URL, image label, we'll need to replace those in place. Let's come back to our Kubernetes YAML file and we'll grab this sed command. Now this sed command is going to do some interesting things. It's going to go replace all of those things with their secrets. ACR URL, AKS URL, image label, we'll replace that with the GitHub SHA, and we'll do that inside the K8s YAML file. Great. Now we can come in here and commit this. Let's say build file. Commit. Now this build file is just another file inside of our repository. So if we come in here and we say git pull, well, that does all the things. We now have this file in our repository and we can edit it in the way that we would edit any other file. Perfect. Because it's in this .github/workflows folder, then we can come back in here to actions and we can see this action running. Coming back to our source code, we see that there's a build that started. Let's dig into that build. Here's the details. Now this build will do all the things. Check out, Docker login, Kubernetes set context, and then run. It's starting to run the build file, so we can see some of the steps that we're doing. I'll fast forward this video just so that you don't need to watch all the steps, but basically it's going to do all the steps in our Docker file. .NET restore, .NET build, .NET test, .NET publish, copy that into our other repository, and then once it finishes with that Docker file, it will be able to publish that image up to Azure Container Registry and finally run it in Azure. It looks like that succeeded. Now it does take a minute for the build to, for the DNS settings to propagate, so we can use some port forwarding here to get us where we need to go. kubectl port forward service / level up DevOps. We'll go 8080 on our local machine to port 80 inside the container. And now we're port forwarded straight into that service. If we go to localhost 8080, we see the website running. Here's the website that we just published. A kubectl get all. We see that we now have that content in place in Azure. This was really great. We built our website. We created the Docker file, the Docker ignore file, the Kubernetes YAML file, and we created a GitHub Actions DevOps pipeline that built that Docker file, pushed it to the registry, and ultimately deployed that to Azure. You can get the code that we just built right here in this GitHub repository. And if you have any questions, hit me up on that spot designated by the